Welcome to Unit 4, Video 2, Causes of the Revolution, the Stamp Act and Colonial Protests. In 1765, the easiest way to become unpopular with your neighbors was to be appointed by the king to collect his latest tax. The main idea for today's video is an attempt to impose a new type of tax sparked open protests and violent action, which forced the British government to repeal the tax. A new kind of tax. Passed by Parliament in 1765, the Stamp Act provoked an even greater storm of protest. Unlike previous laws, the Stamp Act did nothing to further Britain's mercantilism aims. Instead, it was designed purely to raise revenue to pay for the soldiers stationed in the colonies. The Stamp Act required that all printed materials have a special government stamp. Items subject to the law included newspapers, playing cards, court documents, and sales receipts for land. So, for example, a person selling or buying a piece of land would also pay a British official to stamp the sales document. Colonists could only pay officials for the stamp with gold or silver coins, both of which were rare in the colonies. British courts enforced the Stamp Act by taking away any land or property involved in sales conducted without the stamps. To the colonists, the Stamp Act was a shocking example of taxation without representation. Philadelphia merchant John Raynell said, "The point in dispute is a very important one. If the Americans are to be taxed by a parliament where they are not nor can be represented, they are no longer Englishmen but slaves." Protesting British goods. Colonial reactions to the Stamp Act were increasingly angry. Patrick Henry was a young politician and newly elected to Virginia's House of Burgesses. He persuaded the Assembly to pass a series of resolutions that defended the colonists' right to tax themselves rather than to be taxed by Parliament. The resolutions declared that the General Assembly of this colony have the sole right to lay taxes and impositions upon its inhabitants. When newspapers spread word of Virginia's action, other colonies responded. Rhode Island instructed officials to ignore the Stamp Act. Several other colonies passed resolutions similar to Virginia's resolution. Colonists in cities such as Boston and Philadelphia soon realized they had more in common with each other than with Britain, and they began to organize. In Boston, a group rioted against the Stamp Act. They damaged the home of Andrew Oliver, the official in charge of stamping documents, and destroyed the governor's house. Oliver promptly resigned. Protesters in other colonies also acted to prevent the distribution of stamps. By the end of 1765, the stamp distributors in all the colonies except Georgia had resigned. Some of the men who led the angry crowds called themselves the Sons of Liberty. They were mostly merchants, shoekeepers, and craftsmen. The Sons of Liberty also organized a boycott, which is a form of protest that involves refusing to purchase goods or services. Merchants in New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia agreed to stop importing goods from Britain. In 1766, the protesters succeeded. Parliament repealed, or canceled, the Stamp Act. The colonists had taken their first major step toward independence from Britain and creating a new American identity. Imagine you're a young Boston colonist in 1768. "Sorry, son, there's no tea today," your mother says at breakfast. "We're boycotting British imports again." How would you feel about doing without your favorite food or drink to make a point? The Townshend Acts. Colonists celebrated the Stamp Act's repeal. However, the British government insisted that it had not lost any authority over the colonies, but with the Stamp Act repealed, or cancelled, Britain had to figure out other ways of gaining revenue. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend, a British royal treasurer. The acts placed duties on tea, glass, paper, lead, and paint, all goods that the colonies were required to purchase only from Britain. The revenue from the Townshend Acts would be used to the British to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. Previously, these officials had been paid by the colonial assemblies. By paying officials directly, the British government would establish greater control over the day-to-day running of the colonies. The Townshend Acts also required colonial courts to provide writs of assistance or search warrants, so officials could search houses and businesses for smuggled goods. Writs of assistance had existed for several years, and colonists had protested them. To the colonists, the writs allowed the British to search without cause and to justify random searches, and the Townshend Acts only expanded their use. The colonists react. Colonists once again protested and accused the British government of tyranny. The protesters were strongly influenced by the 17th century British philosopher John Locke, who wrote that a leader could rule only with the consent of the people. He stated that government exists to uphold natural rights, or rights such as life or liberty that a person is born with. Any government that failed in this task should be overthrown. The colonists strongly identified with Locke's way of thinking. The Sons of Liberty. Samuel Adams was a follower of Locke's philosophy, a member of the Massachusetts Assembly, and a leader of the Sons of Liberty. In 1768, Adams co-wrote a letter with lawyer James Otis to the other colonial assemblies. The letter objected to the new duties and proposed a boycott of British goods. The British governor of Massachusetts threatened to dismiss the assembly if it did not take back the letter. Defiantly, the assembly refused, and it was disbanded. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty vigorously continued to support actions against the Townshend Acts. Colonists in Boston signed an agreement to boycott British imports, and merchants in New York soon followed. Women also used their purchasing power to protest the Townshend Acts. A group called Daughters of Liberty boycotted imported tea and clothing. To replace imported cloth, they wove their own fabric, known as the homespun, from American yarn and wool. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s also helped push the colonists toward rebellion and independence. During that revival movement, believers challenged the authority of their church leaders. They learned to use their own judgment in matters of religion. The habit of thinking independently spread throughout the colonies. Just a quick review before we end the video. The Stamp Act was a law passed in 1765 that required all printed materials have a special government stamp. The Townshend Acts, taxes placed on tea, glass, paper, lead, and paint. And the Sons of Liberty was a group who led boycotts against English goods. That's all for today's video.